In this video, we're going to take a look at how we can validate forms with Shadcn UI and Zod for form validation within a Next.js 14 project. Now, this is the small form we're going to be building. I've built upon the examples that Shadcn UI have in their documentation, but I've added a little bit more complexity to this example. So we can see we've got a bunch of form fields here. If we try and hit submit, obviously we get displayed with a bunch of error messages. If we fill out this form then to get rid of these error messages, let's add an account type as well. Let's add a personal account type. Let's hit submit now, and we can see that we also have a password confirm validation. So we can see that these passwords don't match. Let's start typing in the password, the same password. There we go. We have a valid password confirm, but also we've got a little bit more of complexity here with the account type. So if we select a company account type, then we have some additional validation. We have an additional field called company name. So we try and hit submit when our account type is set to company, but we don't have a company name. We also need to fill in this field as well. So it may seem a little bit basic, but we are covering a little bit of complexity and a couple of different use cases. So let's get right into it then. Now, I've already got a blank Next.js 14 project up and running, and I've already installed Shadcn UI. From here, all we're going to do is add our form to the home page. So we're going to turn this page as well into a client component. So we need to add use client at the top here because we have to have our forms render in a client component because it depends on things like React hooks and context and things like that. So browser specific APIs. From here, let's refer to the Shadcn UI documentation for forms. So Shadcn uses React hook form to handle building out forms, and it also contains some form components that we can use. Additionally, Shadcn uses Zod for form validation. So if we scroll down to the form documentation, if we scroll all the way down, we want to scroll down to the installation. We want to install npx Shadcn UI at latest add form. So let's copy this command and paste it in our terminal to install everything to do with forms for Shadcn UI. From here, we need to create our form definition using React hook form. So at the top here, we need to import all as Zod from Zod. So Zod, remember, is handling our form validation. And we need to import use form from React hook form. So let's import use form from React hook form. Additionally, we need to import the Zod resolver from @hookform/resolvers/Zod. Now, this Zod resolver is going to hook into the React hook form, and anytime our form data changes, it's going to revalidate that data based on the rules we provide in our Zod configuration for our form. So first of all, we need to create a form schema, which will define all of the properties and the property types and the validation for our form. So to do that, we can, at the top here, go const form schema and set this equal to, we need to use Zod here. However, common practice here is to import all as Z from Zod. This sounds a bit weird, and if you're American, you're probably laughing at that, but we need to import all as Z from Zod here. It doesn't matter if we call it import all as Zod from Zod, but all across the documentation for Zod, everyone imports it as Z from Zod. So then we can use Z.object. So we're saying here our form data is an object, and on this object, we're going to have a bunch of fields. So first of all, let's start off with an email address. So we're going to set this equal to z.string. So this is built in from Zod. So whenever we're calling this string function here, we're telling the form schema that email address is of type string. Additionally, we can use the .email function. So this is saying that this is of type string, but also it has to conform to, or it has to be a valid email address. So we don't have to set up any configuration for this. This comes out of the box with Zod. So it's automatically going to validate if this email address is a valid email or not. Now, before we add any more fields, I think it makes sense that we add our form and just test out to see if this form schema and our form validation is actually all working correctly. So within our home function then, let's create a const form and set this equal to use form. Now, because we're using TypeScript here, we need to tell the use form hook the field values and their types. So to do that, because use form is a generic function, we can pass a type to it. Now the type we need to pass to the use form hook is z.infer. And again, this z.infer is also a generic, so we can pass a type to this. And we want to add here type of and reference our form schema const. So all this is going to do is essentially map all of our fields and types of those fields to our use form hook from our schema. So we're inferring the type of our form based on our form schema. Next, we need to pass in a configuration object to our use form hook. The first we need to pass is a resolver, and we need to set this equal to Zod resolver, which we're importing at the top here from @hookform/resolvers/Zod, and we just need to pass in our form schema. Now, what this is going to do is the Zod resolver is going to take our form schema, and it's going to map, remember, the React hook form and Zod know nothing about each other, but this Zod resolver is going to link the two. So what's going to happen is the Zod resolver is going to take our form schema, and anytime our data changes, it's going to revalidate that data based on our form schema. And based on the validation rules, we pass to our form schema. Obviously, at the moment, we just have an email address. We're saying it's of type string, and it's an email. From here, there's one last thing we need to do to our use form hook, and that is add some default values. Now we need to add some default values here, and we want to add an email address just set equal to an empty string. So from here then, all we need to do is add our form markup. So within our main tag here, we want to render the form component from @/components/UI/form. So this is coming from Shadcn. Now we need to pass to this form component all the values that get returned from use form as props. So to do that, we can use the spread operator and just spread form in as all of the props to the form component. Within here then, we need to add a form tag, and let's add at the top here, let's add a const handle submit. And for now, let's just add an empty arrow function. The handle submit here, we're going to set this equal to on our form on submit. However, we need to pass to our on submit here, the form.on handle submit. So it's coming from the form object that gets returned from use form. So React hook form is going to take care of the submission of this form, but we want to pass in our submit handler. Obviously, we need to tap into this submit handler anytime the form was submitted. Now what's going to happen is anytime our form is invalid, our handle submit function is not going to execute. It's not going to fire. So our handle submit will only run when our form is valid. So all of this is handled by the setup we've just done now using the React hook form and Zod. With that said, within our form, we need to add some inputs. To do that, we need to add a form field component, which we can import to the top here from @/components/UI/form. Again, this is coming from Shadcn UI. Now we need to add a name to this form field, and the name needs to be equal to whichever value we specified in our form schema. So this particular form field is going to be the email address. So we have to call it email address. Now there is one prop we can pass to form field called control. And if we set this equal to form.control, then we'll get some nice IntelliSense on our name. So now we can see we're getting an error on name. And that is because we need to specify a valid value that comes from our form schema. And of course, at the moment, we only have email address. We can see this coming up in our IntelliSense. If we didn't have this control prop set, then we wouldn't get this nice IntelliSense. So make sure you've got the control prop set, and let's select email address for this form field. Finally, for this form field, all we need to add is a render prop. So let's add a render prop, and the render prop will be passed a callback function. And as part of the first argument to this callback function, it will receive a field property. Now we need to return some markup from this render prop. So in here, let's return a form item, which we can import at the top of our file here from @/components/UI/form. Again, this comes from Shadcn UI. Now, the reason we want a form item here is because it contains React context. So anytime we have some error messages and things like that, then it's going to be part of this React context in our form item. But then any items or any components we render within the form item will have access to that context. So for example, if we want to display an error message, all we need to render is the form message component. And again, we need to import that at the top here from @/components/UI/form. And again, this is coming from Shadcn UI. Now, because we've rendered this form item, anytime we get an error for our email address, because this is using React context under the hood, the form message will automatically display that error message for this field. So we don't need to do any more setup other than this. However, with that said, we do need to actually render some sort of input component above any error messages that we may have. First of all, though, let's add a form label. And again, this is coming from Shadcn UI. And we're going to set this equal to email address. And don't forget to import the form label at the top here from @/components/UI/form. Then underneath the form label, we want to render a form control. Now, the reason we want to render this form control is because it adds anytime we have error messages for our forms or validation errors for our form fields. This form control will add the appropriate ARIA labels to our input. And we're going to render the input within this form control. Now, we don't have to render this form control. This is entirely optional. However, I highly recommend that you do, because then this form control will automatically set the appropriate ARIA labels anytime there's a validation error with this input. So then finally, all we need to do is render an input component. However, the input component doesn't get installed as part of the form from Shadcn UI. So we need to install that separately. So if we head on back to Shadcn UI, let's scroll down to input here in the components, and we want to go to installation. We want to copy the installation script. So it's npx Shadcn UI at latest add input. Let's head on back to our code. Let's paste it in our terminal. Then we should have access now to an input component, which we need to import from @/components/UI/input. And I'm getting an error here for form control because I haven't actually imported it. Need to import form control at the top of our file as well. So for this input, we're going to need to spread the field, sorry, not the form, the field. So this field here, we need to spread into this input component. And we can also add a placeholder if we want to. I'm going to call it email address. And we can add a type if we want to and set it to type email. However, if we save this now, this all should work. So if we run npm run dev in the terminal and take a look at localhost 3000 in the browser, there we go. We can see we have our email address. We don't have a submit button yet, but if we hit enter in the email address, we can see we have invalid email. So first of all, let's add our submit button so it's a bit easier to see what's going on when we submit the form. And also, I'm just going to increase the form width slightly. So quickly back in our code, before we add our next form fields, on our form tag here, let's just add a couple of class names. I'm going to add a max width of something like MD and a width of full. Then we need to add a button at the bottom of this form. And I believe that Shadcn UI, whenever you install Shadcn UI, it automatically adds this button component. So we don't have to add it manually like all the rest of the components from Shadcn UI. However, with that said, we need to import button from @/components/UI/button. And this button, we need to pass a type of submit. And the button text will say submit. Additionally, I'm going to add some class names to our button. I want it full width, so let's go width full here. And let's add some spacing between each of our form elements. So on our form, I'm going to display flex. We're going to have a flex col and a gap of something like 4. So if we save this and take a look in the browser now, there we go. This is looking a lot nicer. Let's hit submit. And there we go. Our validation error is working as expected. From here then, let's add our slightly more complex fields. So we're going to add our password and our confirm password. So let's head on back to our code. First of all, let's scroll to our form schema at the top here. We want to add a password now, and this is going to be of type string. So we need to add z.string here. Now, usually with passwords, you're going to want to have a minimum length of at least 3 characters, so we can use the min function as well. And we want to specify something like 3 in here. Next, let's add our password confirm. So let's add password confirm as well. This also will be of type string. And we don't need to add the min here because we're going to do some custom validation check to make sure password and password confirm both have the same value. To do that, we can use the .refine function. So after our z.object here, we can use the .refine function. Now, this refine function will be passed a callback function, and the first argument to this callback function will contain all the data for our form. So we can see here it's going to contain email address, password, and password confirm. Now, from this callback function, we need to return either true or false. If we return true, we're saying that our form validation is valid. If we return false, we're saying it's invalid. And then we can also provide some error message and targeting as well the appropriate form field. So in here, we want to return if data.password is equal to data.password confirm. Now, this will equal to true if they're both equal to each other, obviously, which means that our form is valid. However, if these aren't equal to each other, then this statement will equal false, and it means that our form is invalid. So to display a custom error message then, based on this validation logic here, we can pass a second argument to the refine function, and we want to pass a message here, and the message is going to be something like passwords do not match. Then we want to pass a path. Now this path will be an array, and we want to specify only one element in this array, and we want to specify the field that this error belongs to, and it should be belonging to the password confirm. So we need to pass password confirm in like so. From here then, all we need to do is add our password and password confirm form fields to our markup. So if we scroll down to our return markup, we may as well just copy the form field we already have for the email address and just modify that. So let's copy our email address form field and paste it underneath. We're going to update the form field name to password. We're going to update the form label to password. The placeholder, again, this will be password. The type will be password. And we want to do exactly the same. We want to copy this now and do exactly the same for the password confirm. So let's update this to say password confirm. We'll have the form label password confirm, placeholder password confirm, and the type will be password. So let's save this now and take a look in the browser. Let's give localhost 3000 a refresh. Let's hit submit. And there we go. We can see we're having error messages now on password and password confirm. Let's make sure this all works though. So let's add test@test.com in here. Let's add a dummy password in here. And then let's add a password which doesn't match the actual password we entered in the first field here. And there we go. We can see our error message saying passwords do not match. Let's add the correct password. And there we go. That error message goes away. So from here, the last bit of complexity we want to add is the drop down for what type of account we have. So if we want to create a personal or a company account, and then if it's a company account, we want to display that optional field of company name. And obviously, if it's a company account, the company name is actually required. So it must be filled in before the form can be submit. So again, let's head on back to our code. Let's add all this in then. If we scroll to the top for our form schema, in our object here, we want to specify account type, and we can set this equal to z.enum, passing in an array of all the allowed values for this form field. So we're only going to allow personal and company. Next, we want to add a company name, and we want to set this equal to z.string. So it's going to be of type string, but by default, we want this to be optional. We don't want this to be a required field, so we can use the optional function. From here, we want to add another custom refine function, because although this company name is optional, we want to check to see if account type is equal to company, then company name must actually be filled in. So we can add this as another refine function in here. Again, we'll pass a callback function, and the callback function will be passed the data for our form. We want to check to see if data.account type is equal to company. If it is, then we want to return if company or data.company name actually has a value. So if data.company name has a value, if account type is equal to company, this statement will return true, which means our form is valid. However, if account type is equal to company and data.company name doesn't have a value, then this statement will equal to false, which means our form is invalid. Then we also need to add a default return here. So we'll hit this default return if data.account type is equal to personal. So we don't want to do any check on company name if the account type is personal. So we can just return true here. However, we want to add an error message as well, a custom error message, if no company name has been supplied for a company account type. So we can add a message here, and this message will be something like company name is required. And the path for this error message will be, if we scroll to the top here, we need to specify company name. So let's add company name in like so. So all we need to do now is add our remaining form fields in for our account type and our company name. However, account type is going to be a select, which means we need to install the select from Shadcn UI. So let's head on back to the Shadcn documentation. Let's scroll down here to the select. Now we want to scroll down to the installation. Let's copy the CLI command here. It's npx Shadcn UI at latest add select. So let's copy that and head on back to our terminal. Let's paste that in our terminal to install the select package or the select component. Then we can use this select component. If we scroll down, we want to add this actually underneath the email address. So again, we're just going to copy the form field here for email address, and underneath email address, let's paste in our new form field. So this now, our form field will be the account type. And for the render function, it's going to be slightly different here because we need to render our select form field rather than an input. So instead of email address here for the form label, we want to add account type. Now within this form control, we want to remove the input and we want to render a select trigger. Now the select trigger is essentially just that. It's just a part of the DOM which when we click on it, it's going to display the select dropdown. Now the reason Shadcn does it this way is because it means we get so much nicer looking select elements. I don't know about you, but the default select dropdowns just look really ugly and really gross. So this is Shadcn's version of a select, and this is how they implement it. So we have this select trigger. Whenever we click on this select trigger, it will open up that dropdown, i.e. the select options. So then within the select trigger, we want to add a select value, which we need to import from @components/UI/select. And one important thing to note as well is the select trigger and the select value can also be imported. If we scroll to the top here, they can also be imported from this package here. However, I've accidentally imported select trigger from the wrong package or from the wrong place. We need to import select trigger from @components/UI/select. So let's remove the incorrect import at the top here. Then if we scroll down to our markup again, for our select value, we want to add a placeholder, and we'll set this equal to something like select and account type. Then underneath the form control, this is where we want to render our select options. So to do that, we can use the select content from Shadcn UI, and we need to import it from @components/UI/select. Then we want to render the select item. And again, this comes from @components/UI/select. Now we want to render two select items. The first will have a value of personal, and the label will be personal. Then the second will have a value of company, and the label will be company, like so. So we want these values to match the values we have in our form schema. Remember, we said that an account type can only either be personal or company. Now, there's one thing I forgot to do as well for this select, and that is actually to render the select component. So the select component is going to wrap all of our markup here, which means we need to import the select component from @components/UI/select. And we just want to wrap all of this particular bits of markup here from the form label down to the form message. We need to wrap it in the select, and we need to add an onValueChange prop set equal to field.onChange. So if we save this now, and before we take a look in the browser, we need to make sure that we can actually access, whenever we have a valid form submission, we want to be able to access the form field values within the handle submit function. So to do that, we can grab the values that gets passed to handle submit, and this is going to be of type zinfer and type of form schema. So exactly the same as what we've got at the top here. So let's just copy what we've got here for our use form hook and paste this in for our type for our handle submit form values. So then let's just console log our values on a successful form submission. So if we rerun then npm run dev in the terminal, and if we head on over to localhost 3000 again, let's open up our console as well, just so we can see and make sure everything is working. Let's first of all hit submit on our form, and there we go. We can see all of the appropriate error messages are displaying. Let's go through these one by one. Let's add test@test.com. The email address goes away. We need to select an account type. This is required. So let's select personal first. Let's add in an example password. Let's make sure our password confirm also works. So passwords do not match. Let's make sure that the passwords do match. And there we go. We have no error messages, which means we have a valid form. Let's hit submit, and we can see our values being console logged in our console down here. So from here, all we need to do is hook up our company. So our company name. Anytime we select the company account type, we need to add another field underneath the account type called company name. And one thing as well I'll note is we're getting this error in the console here. If we scroll up, let's find the actual error message. So we've got a component is changing an uncontrolled input to be controlled. Now, the reason this is happening is because if we go back to our code, all of our form field values, aside from, if we scroll down to our use form hook, aside from email address, are actually undefined. So this is why React is actually complaining. We need to set all of our form fields to an empty string. So we can actually see this in the console log in the browser. It says here, this is likely caused by the value changing from undefined to a defined value, which should not happen. So to get around this, we need to set the default values to an empty string. So the value is defined. So again, if we head on back to our code, let's add in the default values. The account type, we don't actually need to add a default value because that's going to be changed via the select. However, the password, we need to set to an empty string. The password confirm, we need to set to an empty string. And the company name, which we're not using yet, but we're actually going to implement now, we want to set that to an empty string as well. So then let's implement this company name. First of all, we need to grab the value of the account type. Now, the only way so far we can grab a form field value is via this handle submit. Ideally, though, we want to hook into any time the account type changes on our form. We want to hook into that change. And then if the account type is equal to company, then we'll conditionally render a new input called company name. So to do that with the React hook form, we can just use the watch function. So in here, we can go const account type and set this equal to form.watch. And we want to watch on account type. So anytime account type changes now, this account type const will update. And of course, our component will re-render. So then let's use this account type. Then we want to check to see if it's equal to company. Let's scroll down then. First of all, let's copy our email address form field again. And underneath account type, let's paste in that new field. However, we want to conditionally render this. So we only want to render this if account type is equal to company. Only then will we render the company name form field. So let's add our closing curly brace down here. Now for this form field, we want this to be company name. We want the form label to be company name. The placeholder, again, we want this to be equal to company name. The type, we'll remove this because it's going to be of type text. So if we save this now then, and take a look here in the browser, let's give localhost 3000 a refresh. Let's add our dummy data in for our form fields. We know the password's working, so that's fine. We don't need to check that again. But now let's hit submit. We can see an account type is required. Let's select personal. Let's hit submit now. There we go. We can see our console log for our form values. So this means this was a successful form submission. But now if we select company, let's see what happens if we hit submit. We get this error message. So company name is required. So let's add in a company name. Let's hit submit. And there we go. We have another valid submission.